Indians, Jacks, and Pines, A History of Saginaw by Stuart D. Published in 1962. Preface. This history of Saginaw leans heavily on research done by the late Fred Dustin, Saginaw's best-known historian, and articles that have appeared in the Saginaw News. Mr. Dustin's work is The History of Saginaw. Segments of Saginaw history that are not detailed in this account are detailed in Mr. Dustin's book, and the serious student of Saginaw history is encouraged to read that volume. Nor is this a complete history. It was not intended to be. Rather, it is to present the high spots of Saginaw's development, and every effort has been made to choose for illustration the colorful events that made Saginaw known as the lumbering capital of the world. Histories of early America sometimes make it appear that the white man is the villain and the Indian is innocent victim of the settling of the West, and truly neither viewpoint is correct. The Indian was primitive. He lived in the Stone Age with bows and arrows as weapons. The white man who came to these shores was the product of a civilization that had learned to read and write, and his science had developed to the point where he could till the land and produce food far easier and in greater quantities than the Indian could. This history does not attempt to explain why white men displaced the Indian. Neither will it attempt to defend the Indian. It is ridiculous to think the Indian could go on and on living as he did in this country and never be displaced. Unfortunately, for our peace of conscience, the deed was done by our great-grandfathers. It is too near home for us all to try to justify what happened. Nor will this history shed tears on the cutting of the great pine forests. The pine was here to cut, but we must admit, our great-grandfathers wasted the pine. With careful management, the pine could have been harvested without complete destruction of the forests. Saginaw's history is robust and colorful, and we hope this history reflects some of that color and robustness. Stuart D. Gross. Chapter 1. Before the White Man. In the beginning it wasn't known as Saginaw, nor were the Indians, those master hunters, the first to live here. There were people living here 13,000 years ago. Their crude stone implements have been found in the sandy graves near St. Charles in Saginaw County. Nor was the land always as you see it today. Some 50,000 years ago it was covered by water. This has been called by the geologists as the Huronic Sea or Lake Warren. What is now Lake Michigan, geologists named Lake Chicago. At the time of Lake Warren and Lake Chicago, you could have journeyed from Saginaw to Lake Michigan straight across the state in a canoe. The route would have been almost a straight line along a glacial spillway that carried westward the outflow from Lake Warren. This lake embraced in a single great basin what now are known as Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie, the southern part of Lake Huron, and much of eastern Michigan and southeastern Ontario. As the huge glaciers advanced and retreated over the centuries, the contours of the land were gradually changed, leaving it much as you see it today. The spillway dried up, but its original bed with westward flowing water was to intrigue men who came later to settle in Saginaw. They dreamed of a ship canal across the waste of Michigan that would tie the Saginaw, Shiawassee, Bad, Maple, and Grand Rivers together, and they made an attempt to build such a canal. The early shores of Lake Warren are still marked by sand deposits visible in Monroe, Washtenaw, Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, St. Clair, Sanilac, Huron, Tuscola, Saginaw Bay, Aranac, Gladwin, Midland, Isabella, and Gratiot counties. Some of these sand deposits, ground fine by the glaciers and smoothed by the hundreds and hundreds of years of wind, have been found valuable for the foundry business that settled in Saginaw. One of these sand pits is in Tuscola County, between Millington and Caro. Another is visible from an automobile along Highway M46 east of Saginaw and just beyond Richville. The glaciers also left rich lands that produced great quantities of natural food for the Indians. Black walnuts, beech nuts, butternuts, red and black cherries, and blackberries. The sap from the maple trees was boiled to make maple sugar, one of the few luxuries of Indian life. The pin, or the wild potato, from which Pinconning in Bay County takes its name, was found along the streams. Wild rice grew in the shallow waters of the Shiawassee River and served not only as food for the Indian, but also attracted the ducks and geese that the Indian hunted. The rivers were the highways for the Indians. It is easy to understand why the Indians congregated here. The Saginaw River, which empties into Saginaw Bay, is formed by the Tittabawassee, Shiawassee, Cass, and Flint rivers. From Saginaw, an Indian could travel by canoe deep into the Thumb area or into the middle of lower Michigan. He could also go down the Saginaw to Saginaw Bay and eastward to the Atlantic Ocean. Today, great ships from foreign countries follow this same route up the St. Lawrence River, across Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, up Lake Huron to Saginaw Bay, and the shipping docks of the industries that now line the shores of the Saginaw River. The Sauk Indians were among the first known Indian tribes to settle here, but soon another tribe of Indians, the fierce Chippewas, made war on them. The Chippewas planned their attack with care. The chiefs met on an island in the Straits of Mackinac. After several days of council talks, the chiefs sent out war parties against the Sauks. The Indian warriors traveled by canoe down Lake Huron and into Saginaw Bay. They hid along the shore in the daytime to keep from being seen by any wandering Sauk brave that might be out hunting. The surprise was indeed complete. The Sauk Indians were all but exterminated. An island in the Saginaw River was so covered with the dead that it became known as Skull Island. Today it is called Crow Island. The Chippewa gave Saginaw its name. They called it Sagi-an-ti-na-kiwat, which means where the Sagi or Sauk were. The name Saginaw has passed through many forms, more different spellings before it reached its final form. Although the Sauks were defeated and driven away, the Chippewas for years lived in fear of them. There arose the legend of the avenging Sauk. It was told around the campfires and in the wigwams so often and with such detail that the Chippewa came to believe it. As the legend goes, one Sauk brave was killed in the attack trying to defend his sweetheart. Later, the Chippewas claimed to see the ghost of this brave walk from the forest. The ghost would stand in a clearing near the village and stare accusingly at the Chippewa. So great was the fear of this specter that entire villages would flee in panic. Some of the early white men made use of this fear to frighten Indians from the villages. While the Indians were hiding in the forest, the white men would loot furs from the wigwams. Chapter 2. Indian Life. One of the first Indian camps in Saginaw was built at a place known by the Indians as O-Zwa-Washqua, or Greenpoint. Greenpoint is the southern part of Saginaw where the Shiawassee and Tittabawassee rivers join to form the Saginaw River. Here thousands of Indian arrowheads, spear points, pottery, totem symbols, axe heads, and Indian scrapers have been found. Trails led from this village to other points in Michigan. Two went south to Detroit. One of these trails went by way of the present-day Bridgeport and Flint, another by way of Chesaning and Owasso, and still another trail led west to Lake Michigan from Bad River, Saginaw County, tributary of the Shiawassee, and the Grand River which empties into Lake Michigan. One of the most famous of the trails was known as the Mackinac Trail. This trail snaked through the forest from Detroit to Sault Ste. Marie and followed in part present Mackinac Road. It passed through or near the present sites of Royal Oak, Pontiac, Clarkston, Grand Blanc, Flint, Mooresville, Bridgeport, Saginaw, Freeland, Midland, and Edenville. At Edenville, the Saginaw Trail continued north and west to Grand Traverse Bay, while the Mackinac Trail went north through or near Highwood, Secord, West Branch, Damon, Luzerne, Red Oak, Atlanta, Tower, Manning, and Sheboygan to Mackinac City. Crossing the Mackinac Straits to St. Ignace, the route followed to Sault Ste. Marie. This was the historic Mackinac Trail. However, in 1959, the Michigan legislature gave the Mackinac Trail designation Highway 131 on the western side of the state. The logic for this is unknown. The Michigan Indian did not live in a teepee. The teepee was home to the Indians of the Great Plains, the Dakota, Sioux, Comanche, and Crow. In Michigan, the Indian's home was an oval wigwam. It was shaped like a big beaver's house. Its frame was made by tying small trees together, and it was covered with bark. In the center of this wigwam, a hole was dug in the ground about 2 feet across and a foot or so deep. Stones as large as a man's 2 fists were put in at the bottom, and a fire was built on top of that. In cold weather, these stones held the heat throughout the night. A small smoke hole was left in the roof of the wigwam, and when well built, these wigwams were fairly comfortable. The Indian was constantly moving according to the season of the year. In summer he built his camp on high ground, usually on a riverbank, so breezes would help blow away the pesky mosquitoes and black flies. For winter he moved to the lower grounds along the river bottoms. There the dense forest helped him protect him from the winter's winds. Just as people do today, the Indian liked to live with friends and family. Family ties were indeed strong. They lived together in clans, and each clan had a symbol. Thus developed the Beaver Clan, the Deer Clan, and the Turtle Clan. The clans showed who they were by chipping the figure of their totem from stone or carving it from wood. Sometimes the symbols were polished to make them very beautiful. There were many of these clans in Michigan. Remains of 150 village sites have been found in Saginaw County alone. The largest village site was on Greenpoint. Other sites have been found along riverbanks. The Indian built on high riverbanks so he could see long distances in all directions. He had to constantly be alert to an attack by an enemy. Some Indian village sites have been located by farmers plowing their fields. The plow point may turn up arrowheads or pieces of pottery, and if enough of these are found, it can be assumed that this particular location once was the site of an Indian village. Indians also buried items with their dead, and Indian burial mounds are a rich source of artifacts of Indian life. One of the largest of these mounds is in Saginaw was at the site of the present city waterworks plant on Ruster Drive. Chapter 3. The Hunter. An Indian couldn't afford to be lazy. There was much to do keeping food in the wigwam and tanning animal skins for clothing. The Indian's chief weapon were the bow and arrow, a flint knife, and a stone hatchet. The bow was made of ash, hickory, or oak wood. The arrows were of arrowwood, a type of shoot that came from sheepberry or cranberry bushes. The straightest of these stems were used, tipped with an arrow point that was chipped from stone. Much of the stone for the arrowheads and the other crude tools came from the great limestone deposits at Bayport on Saginaw Bay in Huron County. Although game was plentiful, it was not easy to kill. The bow and arrow was not too good as a weapon. The hunter had to get close to his quarry before he could be sure of hitting it in a vital spot. So the Indian stalked his game. He watched at the salt licks, and he hid among the runways or lay in ambush along the streams where he knew the animals came to drink. In winter he could follow deer tracks. It wasn't unusual for an Indian to follow a deer for 2 or 3 days until the animal became so exhausted that it could no longer run. The Indian then could get close enough to shoot. Fishing was an easier way for the Indian to get a meal. The streams were filled with catfish, pike, large and smallmouth bass, walleyes, suckers, and even the great sturgeon in the Saginaw River. One way was to trap the fish. The Indians put baskets or nets in the water and then built fences in the stream to guide the fish into the trap. Sometimes, however, they waded into the streams and actually drove the fish into the nets. A more common way was to spear the fish. Fish spears made of bone were used widely by the Indians. During the spring run of suckers, it was easy for the Indian to stand in the stream and spear as many fish as he wanted. One of the Indian's big problems was the preserving of his foods. Of course, he had no corner grocery, no refrigerator nor freezer to keep the meat fresh. When he killed a deer, he ate as much as he could at once. This was especially true in warm weather, when meat spoils quickly. But the Indian did have a way to preserve food that would keep. He dug pits in dry soil where the drainage was good. The pits were carefully lined with bark and would keep perfectly not only corn, but nuts, dried berries, plums, maple sugar, and wild rice. The white man called these corn pits. The Indian also dried and pounded lean meat for preservation and packed it away in sacks of hide. This is called pemmican, and the Indian could carry this dried meat in a pouch as he hunted in the woods. The animals the Indians killed provided their clothing. The skin was tanned. This process involved scraping the hide to remove all particles of flesh and then treating it with salt by drying. Deer hide was used most often, but elk, bear, beaver, and otter skins also were quite popular. The men and women made their own clothing. It was a slow process. There was no sewing machines, nothing resembling scissors. Bone awls were used in place of needles. The tough sinew from the animals were used as thread, and porcupine quills were used as ornamentation. The typical costume for a man was a shirt which hung to his hips. There was a hood that could be drawn over the head in cold weather. He also wore a breechcloth and long leggings tied to a belt around the waist. The women wore dresses with loose sleeves ending at the elbows and taken in at the waist with a belt. They too wore leggings. The free edges of these clothes were left long and were fringed by cutting in narrow strips. This was not for ornament. The fringing prevented the skin from puckering and wrinkling when it became wet. White hunters were quick to copy the idea. In warm weather, the men sometimes went without shirts and leggings, but the mosquitoes and flies were pestiferous, and the braves often wore their leather shirts for protection. The use of feathers was not common. Occasionally, eagle feathers were worn, much the same as a soldier wears a medal of honor or other decorations. A warrior who had scalped an enemy wore 2 feathers. If he had taken a wounded prisoner, 5 feathers were arranged in a certain design as a head decoration. The elaborate headgears of feathers were used by the Sioux of the plains, but never by the Chippewa. Smoking was enjoyed by the Indians. They fashioned their pipes from stone, but more often made them of pottery. The Indian had learned the secret of making pottery for cooking, and was skilled in turning out vessels for water containers and others tempered for use over the fire. Eating utensils like the knife, fork, and spoon were unknown in the wigwam. A stout branch from a tree was used to lift the meat from the fire, and when the food had cooled, the Indian ate it with his fingers. Many an Indian brave must have laughed at himself at the strange ways of the white man who did not know the ways of nature. Now some Indian names. Bad River. The 2 branches of this river are now called the North and South branches. They empty into the Shiawassee River. The Chippewa gave each branch a name. The South branch was called Machi-Sebi, which literally means Bad River because of the difficulty in navigating it. The North branch was Missabox or White Rabbit, so called because of the many snowshoe or white rabbits on the banks. Maquassibi, this means Bear River, which enters the Shiawassee River in St. Charles Township. Nottoway, this means I bring him in a canoe. It's also the translation for the Cass River. Crow Island, in the Treaty of 1819, certain lands, including an island in the Saginaw River, were reserved for Kishkako the Crow, said to be a minor chief of the Chippewas. This bit of land still bears his name. The island also has been known as Skull Island, dating back to the savage battle when the Chippewas drove the Sauk from the Saginaw Valley. Sheboygan Creek, place of the Big Apple. This may be an incorrect interpretation. Other authorities say that Sheboygan means a sound like that of the passing of a needle through fabric or skin. Seboing means little river. Shiawassee means green river, taken from the vast green marshes above its mouth. Swan Creek, an erroneous rendering of Sebi, all e's pronounced as in eat. Its true meaning is Duck Creek. Tittabawassee, a corruption and shortening of the Indian phrase signifying the river that follows the shore. Note its course on the map, making about the same curve that the Saginaw Bay shows. Chesaning, the Big Rock place. When the first white settlers arrived in this vicinity, there was a great limestone rock in the river, but it later was broken up and used for making lime. Also at some distance eastward, there still remains a huge boulder which may have had its part in the Indian designation. This has been supposedly the Chesaning Big Rock. And when we continue next time with Chapter 4, The White Man Comes, or There Goes the Neighborhood.